What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Live here on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Ryan Thomas here, letting you guys know that obviously the subject matter at hand is Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr., recapping that fight that took place last night on Triller. Everything that Tyson versus Jones Jr. represented last night in the history of combat sports, how we look back on it. We'll be diving into that and much, much more. First, I want to remind you guys to fire away some comments in the comment section below. Whether you're tuning in on Facebook, the Thomas Take Facebook page, the Thomas Take on YouTube, or tuning in on Periscope on my Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. I want to remind you guys as well that the Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. recap will be available as well on all major podcasting platforms, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud. It's available on every which platform you can find your podcast. Wherever you're tuning in, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, my podcast is available for your listening and viewing pleasure. In the corner there, the Thomas Take logo. This is a combat sports episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. As always, I love diving into the fights after the fact as well as before the fact with previews and predictions. I previewed and predicted this bout between Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. At last, finally, this fight took place. And, you know, it didn't take place when it was supposed to. 2003, 2002, 2004. Those were the years that this fight was really hot, if you will. This was a time where, you know, Mike Tyson was on his way out. Roy Jones Jr. was on the come up in terms of their primes, but Mike Tyson still has drawing power. That's what we proved. That's what we saw. That's what was proven in the boxing world last night. That Mike Tyson is still very, very much a draw in the boxing world at 54 years old. I don't know what that says about the state of boxing in and of itself, but it says a lot about Mike Tyson and the ability that he has as a draw. I know a lot of sports fans out there, and typically they are not boxing fans, but they were watching last night. They were tuning in last night to Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr., and I thought that in terms of the event itself, I thought that the ambiance, the decor, the production value that Triller brought to the table with Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. was actually very well done. The black setting, the white ring with the white ropes, I thought it looked fantastic. I thought that the commentators, Mauro Ranallo, a combat commentator veteran, Sugar Ray Leonard, one of the greatest boxing champions that boxing has ever seen, and yes, the commentating debut of one UFC middleweight champion, Israel Adesanya. I thought all three of those guys were really good last night. I thought all three of those guys were a great trio. I'd like to see more of that trio again in terms of another boxing card, whether it's Triller Presents or anybody else presenting a card to us via boxing. I thought that all three of those guys meshed very well. I look at that as a key factor in the entertainment value of any fight card that I watch, whether it's a UFC fight card, whether it's a boxing fight card. I look deeply at the commentators and assess those three commentators or two commentators or even four commentators, which we saw last night. Shout out to Snoop Dogg, D-O-double-G. He did his thing last night on the mic, commentating, and on the mic, rapping out his greatest hits. I thought that it was an awesome, awesome night. You had a lot of performances from rappers, whether they're new rappers or older rappers like Snoop Dogg. I thought it was really awesome, and I thought that it was different. It was a different night of fights, to say the least. It was unprecedented. It was an unprecedented night of fights, but I really want to talk about the fights, and then I'll go back to the entertainment value aspect that this card represented, and obviously dive deeper into the main event. First off, did the card simply deliver? Did it deliver? That's a question that I'm going to really dive into and really answer for you guys on this show, because I know a lot of people were asking me, hey, what did you think of the fights? Got a lot of text messages this morning, got a lot of inboxes on my Facebook or on my Twitter or whatever that people were saying, what did you think of this fight? Did you think it was a good fight? I thought it was a great card overall in terms of the entertainment value. The entertainment value I thought was there in spades last night. I want to talk about the dominant return of Badu Jack, a guy that is in the camp of Badu Jack, a gentleman by the name of Amir Abdallah, someone that I have been friends with along the Lockport, New York circuit, back to his kickboxing days. Watched a lot of his fights over the years. He promoted this fight pretty heavily, and he did a great job of letting the whole world know that Badu Jack was returning to form in this fight. And not only did Badu Jack return to form, but I thought the fight itself showed that for Badu Jack to, stumble along the way, former 2-division champ, now trying to reclaim what was once his, I thought this was a great step up, I guess you could say, towards getting what he feels he deserves, another title shot, another crack at getting his belts back. And what a dominant performance from Badu Jack. His dominant form returned, safe to say, last night on the Mike Tyson, Roy Jones Jr. fight card. Fight that I want to dive into next, Jake Paul versus Nate Robinson. Now, I have to dive into this fight a little bit deeper. And what's crazy is I just talked about Badu Jack, who is a true boxer, great, a guy that is one of the best boxers of his generation in his weight class. And I touched on that for only a brief moment. And I'll be discussing this fight between Jake Paul and Nate Robinson in more depth because, guys, this fight is, talking about unprecedented, a YouTuber versus a 3-time NBA slam dunk competition champion. I mean, Nate Robinson is someone that I greatly respect in terms of what he brought to the NBA and in terms of stepping into the boxing ring. I greatly respect anyone that is willing to test those waters within the combat sports realm, whether they're boxers, whether they're MMA fighters, wrestlers, competing in amateur, quote unquote, amateur wrestling, or even professional wrestling. You can get hurt doing that too, for sure. But Nate Robinson had really no business being in that ring. And I hate saying that because it sounds like, I would have done better. I mean, am I going to say I would have done better? I'm going to say that Nate Robinson, for all the training that he did, it didn't look like he trained hardly at all. And I will say, in terms of Jake Paul, before I tell Jake Paul to slow his damn roll and to know his damn role in terms of calling out Dylan Dennis or Conor McGregor, especially Conor, he can call it Dylan Dennis any day of the week, but Conor, come on, let's be real here. I will say that Jake Paul looked like he got better, looked like he improved from his first fight on the Logan Paul KSI card. He fought somebody, I don't even know who he fought, but Jake Paul, I think, is somebody that is entertaining, is a draw in terms of what he brings to the table from the YouTube scene, from the generation of kids that are really on YouTube all the time, trying to monetize a YouTube channel, trying to create content. The Paul brothers have been able to do that. They have successfully done that. They have been able to captivate and cultivate an audience and create content for the viewing pleasure of their target audience. Bringing that target audience over to boxing is essentially what boxing needs. Boxing has needed as many target audiences as it could possibly get within the last 15, 20 years. And for Jake Paul to fight Nate Robinson, Jake Paul's second pro fight, Nate Robinson's pro debut, and to knock out Nate Robinson, that's great for Jake Paul. But with that comes the fact that Jake Paul literally called out Dylan Dennis and Conor McGregor. Know your role, slow your damn roll, and honestly realize and recognize that you're Jake Paul. You're 2-0. You are a YouTuber, and yeah, you're getting better. You're training with the right people. I definitely think those things. I think Jake Paul has done a phenomenal job in terms of finding himself the right training partners to hone his skills and work towards his craft. There were some moments in that fight where, Nate Robinson made it extremely easy for Jake Paul. It's not like Jake Paul put on this, completely epic Parnell Whitaker Floyd Mayweather boxing performance. Nate Robinson running at one point, running with his hands down, trying to throw punches at Jake Paul. I mean, it was really apparent early on that Nate Robinson had no clear-cut professional training that would lead him to victory in that fight. But one thing I will say is, in this society, rather than acknowledging what Nate Robinson did last night in terms of stepping in there, in the society with memes and posts and whatever words, GIFs, whatever you want to, GIFs, whatever you want to call it. I don't even know what they're called. GIFs, GIFs, whatever. Nate Robinson is going to get some crap these next, probably for a while. I mean, for at least the next, year, maybe 2 years, we're going to see, pictures of Nate Robinson just flat on his face, knocked out cold like he was last night. And, I think that's unfortunate. I think that's really unfortunate. I think what gets lost in the shuffle here is that Nate Robinson was making his pro boxing debut against a YouTuber, and 5'9" Nate Robinson versus 5'11", 6'1" Jake Paul. I don't know what Nate Robinson was trying to do in there. I don't know what his strategy was in there. And those are serious discussions. That's not me knocking Nate Robinson. But when you are stepping into, whether it's stepping onto a wrestling mat, stepping into a boxing ring, you better damn well have somewhat of a game plan, somewhat of a strategy, whether you know your opponent or not. If that was the game plan, Nate Robinson didn't fail. The people that trained him, the people that convinced him that was a adequate game plan, those were the people that failed Nate Robinson last night, not Nate Robinson. And listening to some of the corner advice from Nate's corner, thinking to myself, this guy should not be boxing. If you are going to take this step as a quote unquote pro boxer, you better damn well take the step knowing that you have a game plan and knowing and understanding that you got something to prove. You have something that you want to show. And what Nate Robinson showed last night was just, that was bad for boxing. But down the other side of the coin of it is, I'm sitting here on this show, Thomas Take Sports Podcast, the day after, less than a day after, and I'm talking about it. So the fact that I'm talking about it means that, yeah, it was good for boxing. Jake Paul brings a target audience to boxing, that boxing needs as many target audiences as possible, because boxing has been a failing product for probably the good part of the last 10, 15 years. I mean, that's why you have to dust off guys like Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. and some of the names that have come back, Floyd Mayweather. When you think that those guys are done, they're never really done, because boxing needs those guys to always leave that door open. And Tyson's left that door open for a long time. He finally, walked through it, stepped into the ring with Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr. inactive for only 3 years. 3 years is a long time to be inactive in anything, let alone stepping into a ring to get punched in the face. So I'll dive into that a little bit more. But was the fight good for boxing, Jake Paul versus Nate Robinson? And in terms of Nate Robinson, no. I mean, that was not boxing. That was lunging. That was stuff that I learned as a youngster not to do in any fight, whether you're playing in the backyard brawling, whether you're in any schoolyard, whatever. You never run with reckless abandon towards your opponent with your chin up and your hands down. And Nate Robinson did that multiple times, not only en route to get knocked down, but en route to get knocked out as well. Knocked down first, then knocked out shortly thereafter. So let's get into the main discussion, the main topic at hand. I will get to your comments as well. I see a few trickling in here, so obviously feel free to comment on this video, and I'd love to read the comments that you guys have, and what you guys have to say as well. That's what makes this show so awesome. So for the first time in 15 years, we lived in a Mike Tyson fight week. And I want to say that watching that fight last night on Triller and seeing the fight take place, I thought that it made me miss the old guard, Mike Tyson being a part of that. Made me realize that Mike Tyson is a very much missed figure in the sport of boxing, whether he's returning at 54 or not. The fact that you had a Tyson fight week to live through was pretty damn cool. I don't know about you guys. I thought that was pretty awesome. The lead up to this fight was really cool. The moment that this fight was announced back in June or July, I thought that this was an awesome, momentous fight for boxing in terms of two legends, two former champs wanting to get in there. Now, all week long, this week, all I heard was just whining, constant whining from boxing pundits and boxing fans, so-called boxing fans, that said that this fight was a joke, that this fight shouldn't happen, that one of these guys is going to get hurt, that Mike Tyson isn't over his head, that Roy Jones Jr. is washed up, that these guys are old scrubs. Granted, we know what we know. They know what we know. They know. Mike Tyson knows that he's not the version of himself that he was when he was 19. Roy Jones Jr. knows he's not the version of himself that fought Vinny Paz and just destroyed him. Vinny Paz didn't land a punch in a round against Roy Jones Jr. at one point in that fight, one round in that fight. So both of these guys know that they are not what they once were. So the fact that we just heard constant negativity, constant whining, and I'm going to call it whining, from people that are armchair analysts, people that, have never stepped in there in any form or fashion, whether it's a wrestling match or a boxing match. They've never competed in that realm. It's pretty damn obvious that Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. are far past their prime. So let's take it for what it is. Take it for what it was and say, yeah, two legends decided that they were finally going to fight. Two legends finally said, hey, we want to fight each other. Let's make this happen, and let's put on an event for the fans. And what gets lost in the shuffle of this whole thing is that 2020 has been the worst year that I have ever experienced in terms of, just the world. I mean, for all of us, 2020 has sucked. 2020 has been a dumpster fire. So if there is some light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. are going to fight one another, so be it. That's great. That's fine. I'm more than willing to, say, hey, if this is what's going to entertain me for a Saturday night in 2020, I'll sign up for that. Mike Tyson's comeback. Okay, I'll sign up for that. Knowing that both of these guys are not what they once were, is one thing, but to just state the obvious, play Captain Obvious, Sherlock, no Sherlock, in saying that, these guys are past their prime. No kidding. No kidding. They know that. They know that better than anybody, that they're not what they once were. But I wouldn't want to fight Mike Tyson right now. I wouldn't want to fight Roy Jones Jr. right now. What we saw last night between Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson is the fact that both of these guys are far, very far past their prime. But they both showed what I call glimpses of their former selves in that ring last night. And those moments were pretty damn fun. Those moments that I'll remember watching for a long, long time. Mike Tyson, I thought he looked phenomenal. The fact that Mike Tyson didn't fight for 15 years and fought 16 minutes, 8 2-minute rounds. Talk about that in a little bit. The fact that both of these guys went the distance with one another when, I think Mike Tyson was heavily, heavily doubted going into this fight as far as what type of condition, as far as what type of shape he was in. And I don't think we can debate that. I don't think we can honestly say that we can debate that. We can debate that maybe Tyson is a little slower. We can debate that he's not nearly as fast as he was. Still was fluid in terms of his head movement. He avoided some big punches from Roy Jones Jr. last night and still packed the punch. The last thing to go on a fighter is his power. First thing to go on a fighter is his chin, famously said by Teddy Atlas. So we saw that last night. We saw Tyson land some big shots. We saw Roy Jones Jr. show the fluidity that he's always had, the footwork, the stick and move, the make you miss, try to make you miss and counter and move. We saw that last night, and that was fun. It was fun. The night was fun. The entertainment value, did the card deliver? Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And I'll tell you this, I waited 7-8 years for Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather to finally fight each other. And Roy Jones Jr. at 51 years old and Mike Tyson at 54 years old was far more entertaining than Floyd versus Manny in 2015 when they were fighting. Floyd was 38, 30, whatever, in their late 30s, early 40s. That fight last night between Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. was better than Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather. Can anybody disagree with me on that? I mean, in terms of entertainment value, I think that's a highly agreeable statement. I really don't see much pushback on that in terms of what that fight brought compared to what we expected. When you expect very little, you'll get more in return. I expected two guys to show that they still had the skill sets in spades, in glimpses, and that's exactly what I saw. So I came away from that Tyson Jones Jr. fight coming away with what I thought we would see in that bout. Both guys showing glimpses of their former selves, but both guys respecting one another, and both guys really just trying to put on a great show for the fans that have gone through a very rough year in 2020. So let's get to some of the comments in the comment section below. So let's see here. Now, in terms of the fight itself and the method of victory, I mean, Mike Tyson won that fight, folks. Josh Somberg says, they called it a draw. It was not a draw. Tyson won. I thought Tyson won at least 5 or 6 rounds, at minimum 5 or 6 rounds. I would say probably 5 rounds or 6 rounds. There were 2 rounds where Roy Jones Jr. looked really good, really fluid. He made Tyson miss, and he peppered him a little bit with this quick jab combo that I thought was beautiful, actually. And, I mean, it's so highly disrespectful to just, and I'll go back to this, it's so highly disrespectful for everyone to just acknowledge that both of these guys are past their prime. They know that. And not only do they know that, they both still have ability. I mean, would I be willing to step in the ring with one of those guys after watching that fight? No, I would not. Get my ass whooped by a 54-year-old and by a 51-year-old, and Tyson and Roy Jones Jr., 2 of the greatest boxing champions of all time. They're up there. I mean, of their era, they're the 2 best fighters, arguably, of their era. So, that's how I saw that last night, and it's very interesting to see how the perception of this fight kind of played itself out along the way. So let's see here. Josh also says, good point. It's not like Jake Paul is a technical boxer either. He's an amateur boxer, and Nate Robinson wasn't even in the same stratosphere. Correct. And in terms of, complimenting Jake Paul, I mean, I will say the training and the seriousness that Jake Paul has taken towards boxing far outweighs Nate Robinson's seriousness or willingness to seek out the right training partners. If Nate Robinson really wanted to take this fight seriously, he would have trained with the right people. And it was evident early on in the lead up to this fight to me that Nate Robinson wasn't really taking this as serious as Jake Paul was in terms of surrounding himself with the right training partners, the right coaches, the right nutritionists. And I think Nate Robinson was in great shape, but he wasn't in boxing form or shape. And safe to say, Roy Jones Jr. was not in the boxing shape that we thought he would be in. And in terms of Roy Jones Jr. not being in the boxing shape that we thought he would be in, I thought that beyond like the second round, I thought that Roy Jones Jr. was gassed. And I thought, oh my God, he might get knocked out quick. He was panting, heavily breathing, in his corner there. And Tyson looked physically, he looked very, very good. And, the hot take of the show is that I want to see Mike Tyson fight again. I want to see these legends fight. I'm all about it. I don't think that it's a bad thing at all. I think it's actually a good thing for boxing. I think it's a good thing. It's a good message to people that despite your age, if you feel as if you can still do something, you should get the opportunity to do something. Mike Tyson has proven time and time again, he's been counted out so many times, whether it be in a boxing fight or life, that he can punch back. I think that's motivating. I think that that's very metaphoric in a lot of different ways for all of us. And I think that it would work wonders for boxing to have just these legends, these older guys fight one another. I mean, we can't get too crazy with it. We can't. We have to temper our expectations in terms of really, I would say you have to pick particular guys to really make it sell. You know, Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield, part 3. Who the hell, part 3? Who the hell wouldn't sign up for that? Who the hell wouldn't buy that? Who the hell would degrade that? Well, I know who. Dorks, people that don't understand the fight game, people that don't want to just accept the fact that Mike Tyson can still box at 54 years old and that they never could. I don't know what it is. And I saw it all week long. It was extremely frustrating for me. It was actually insulting, I think, to boxing fans that actually wanted to see this fight, that actually always wanted to see this fight, whether they were getting it in 2003 or in 2020. It's insulting to say, oh, these guys don't belong in a ring. Come on. Really? Really? We're going to say that? No, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to stick up for these guys. They deserve it. They deserved a moment in time where they shared the ring with one another. And folks, they're doing this for charity. They're giving back to charities. What is wrong with this world that we can't do certain things? We're told no. We're told that we can't. We're told constantly. People are so negative, saying you can't do this, you can't do that. No, I can and I will. That's what Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. said, and I can, I will, and I did, and they did. So big ups to Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr., and big ups to anyone that was an integral part in making this fight happen. It deserved to happen. It belonged in combat sports history, and it belonged in combat sports history for what it was. Two guys that are older, but know that they still have enough skill to step into a boxing ring and duke it out. I don't see anything wrong with that. 54 today, 54 for Mike Tyson is like 40 for the average male. 51 for Roy Jones Jr. is like 40 for the average male. Both of these guys were actually considering, all the things, in talking about the physical fitness of Roy Jones Jr. I think Roy Jones Jr. didn't expect Tyson to come right after him the way that he did. And that kind of took him by surprise. But as the fight kind of wound down, Roy Jones Jr. was able to clinch and initiate the clinch and kind of separate and pick and choose when he could clinch. I thought Roy Jones Jr. did a great job at that in moments of the fight in terms of initiating the clinch, wearing down Tyson, trying to wear him down, put his weight on him. I thought that was really smart, a really smart strategy from Roy Jones Jr. And both of these guys' strengths were the same as what they were 20 years ago. That's remarkable. That's incredible. Were they faster? Were they as fast as they used to be? No. They're a lot slower. Did they pack the punch that they once did? I think Tyson landed some hard ones, but those hard ones today would have knocked out a mule 20 years ago. So, the declining skill sets of both of them, we saw glimpses of their old selves. And it was really cool. I enjoyed it. I would love to see it again. I would love to see Tyson get in there with somebody that is a draw from his era, whether it's Holyfield or whether they do the rematch. The fact that it was a draw, I think, was for the purposes that you didn't have necessarily real judges judging this fight. You had former WBC champions like Chad Dawson and Vinny Pazienza and Christy Taylor that scored the fight. Vinny Paz had Roy Jones Jr. winning like the majority of the rounds. I don't know what Vinny Paz was watching, but I thought Tyson won it at least 6 rounds to 2, maybe 5 rounds to 3. And I thought that, Tyson won it, and Chad Dawson scored it pretty closely to what I scored it as, or was it Christy Taylor? Christy Taylor scored it pretty closely to what I scored it as. And I just thought overall, life's too short. Why not try to do something that you've always wanted to do? It was the one fight that never happened that was supposed to happen. Whether it's happening late, there is a saying, and saying is better late than never. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast recapping Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. I loved it. I thought it was great. I thought the card had a lot of real cool moments. The whole, YouTuber versus NBA slam dunk champion thing, that was a little hokey, but, I talked about that. I really thought Jake Paul looked good in there, but for as great as Jake Paul looked, Nate Robinson looked just terrible. And I hope that if Nate Robinson is, I'm not going to say Nate Robinson should never fight again. I'm not going to say that. Nate Robinson should try to fight again. If he wants to fight again, he should. Not going to tell any fighter to not fight. Nate Robinson was a fighter last night. He did step into that ring. That is commendable in and of itself. I give him a lot of credit for that. But Jake Paul took it a little bit more seriously, I think, and surrounded himself with the right people and showed up far more prepared. The strategy for Jake Paul probably went completely out the window due to the lack of strategy from Nate Robinson. So that's how I saw that fight kind of shaping up, and that's how I really enjoyed the whole card. Bout Jack returning to form. That guy is probably going to get his belt back at some point. I'm pretty confident in predicting that. So any other comments? Josh Harper with a long one. Keep these comments short because when I click them, they take up the screen. Josh says, the only problem I had was the price of pay-per-view. In my opinion, it should have been free on national TV. It would have reached a lot more people. Would have been a lot better for boxing, in my opinion. Boxing is a pay-per-view business. It is what it is. It's been a pay-per-view business since the days of Mike Tyson. When you have Mike Tyson fighting, it's going to be on pay-per-view. It's just the way it is, whether he's 54 or 74. It's the way it is. It's just the way it is. I do understand where you're coming from in terms of boxing on national TV. It was built on national TV in the wide world of sports days with Ali and Frazier and the classic fights that we saw over those, that we didn't see, but that our folks saw over those years. But even you watch them on ESPN Plus, the ESPN Classic Boxing, you can see ABC is littered all over it, and that's really cool. That was a cool fact of boxing, but this belonged on pay-per-view. I don't think any national television channel would have got behind this, and because we live in such a soft, pessimistic society that we live in today, no cable entity, no channel, whether it's ESPN or any other, would get behind a 54 or 51-year-old fighter, fighters fighting. They wouldn't put this on TV. I understand where you're coming from in terms of being able to afford, paying $60 for this is a little steep, or $49.95 or whatever it was, but it's just not the reality today, unfortunately. And in general, with Tyson fighting, it's just not the platform that Tyson fights on. He hasn't fought on TV in God knows how long. I probably would say maybe he fought on TV just as a one-off and some of his comeback fights post his arrest. But I think that I thought it was a good event. You have to make money in this industry, and national TV just doesn't guarantee the buy rate purses that pay-per-view does. So for the fighters, it was great. And for the fans, I think it was great. For the fans that are willing to open their minds and understand that it is what it is, I thought it was a great fight, great night of fights, and I look forward to hopefully seeing something like this again. I hope this isn't the end of the Mike Tyson Legends Only League. I don't think it is. I think it's just beginning, and people can hate on it, but at the end of the day, that money still counts pretty well. So I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Ryan Thomas here, reminding you that the Thomas Take Sports Podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, as well as Facebook and YouTube. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I would greatly appreciate it. I have a lot of content on there. Plenty of content along the way in terms of MLB hot stove stuff that's coming out that I've already recorded that I'm going to be posting to the YouTube channel, as well as MMA, boxing. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to talk about today. In particular, the Bills game is at 1 o'clock today. They're taking on the LA Chargers. I'm going to preview and predict that game next, so stay tuned.